when the dead come back to life and become our worst nightmare, the zombie.
Every kind of human attribute is gone. They look human, but they're not who they were.
They're just driven to try to eat human flesh, and they're never satiated.
It is really like a plague, very much like being in a swarm of insects. You're surrounded on all sides, and there is no escape.
They are everything we are most afraid of.
What really makes them frightening, it's not just one zombie, it's a mob. You just can't outrun them. You can't kill all of them.
The notion that they are coming for you simply because you have a beating heart is absolutely terrifying.
Zombies present us with a horrifying reality, with the possibility not just of our own death, but the death of our entire civilization.
All other monsters try to destroy individual humans. Zombies come after the entire human race.
To understand zombies, you have to know where they come from. Our modern zombie comes from a film made in 1968 by a then unknown American director named George Romero, Night of the Living Dead.
What George Romero did was rewrite the book about zombies. He turned zombies into an apocalyptic creature.
He wanted a monster that didn't have a definition. So he created a creature that didn't necessarily have a specific explanation for its origin.
Romero's vision of the end of civilization as a zombie apocalypse captured the primal fears of Americans in 1968. What started as a low-budget horror movie became an international sensation. Today, Romero's zombies continue to come back from the dead in ever greater numbers. More than half of all zombie movies have been made since September 11th, 2001.
They're booming in film, they're booming in literature, they're booming in video games. Everywhere you look, there's a zombie right now. It's ingrained in pop culture.
But Romero did not invent the zombie. The creature has been around as long as man has walked the earth. Zombies first appeared in one of the earliest works of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh.
In one of our oldest known works, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ishtar says, "I will raise up the dead and they will eat the living. The dead will outnumber the living." This sounds a lot like a zombie apocalypse.
The word zombie means animated corpse and comes from the Haitian voodoo religion, which has its roots in Western Africa.
Historically, a zombie is rooted in the voodoo religion, and it's a person who has had their mind controlled by somebody else and is working as a slave.
The voodoo zombie that originated in Africa and ended up in Haiti is very different from Romero's zombie.
The word zombie technically refers to the traditional Haitian voodoo zombie. That has nothing to do with the modern culture of the viral, ravenous, carnivorous horde that we now refer to as zombies.
When we look back, we see that most great civilizations have been afraid of zombie-like creatures coming back from the dead. In China, the living dead are called Jiangshi.
The Jiangshi is a fascinating and terrible monster from Chinese folklore. It's a hungry ghost that returns to devour the living. This ghost rises to attack not only the living, but its own family as a retribution for not being properly buried.
Like many cultures, the Chinese perform burial rituals to make sure the dead pass safely to the afterworld and don't come back to threaten the living.
In improper burial, the spirit doesn't get a chance to move on. It lingers here in torment, and it takes that torment out on those who are responsible for giving it the proper care at the point of death.
Like our zombie, the Jiangshi attacks the living with a terrifying relentlessness.
It's very, very hard to stop it. It's got righteous rage, so to speak, on its side.
While the Chinese zombie returns to punish the living, in Arab folklore, becoming a zombie was punishment for living an immoral life. Their zombie was called the ghoul.
The ghoul is a female demon. Most often it was a demon of a woman. It was someone who had fallen from grace with God, someone who had lived a sinful life. In some of the oldest legends, the demon was a prostitute. They would hide in the desert and call out, much like a siren, and then transform into their natural state, which is a horrific, devouring monster.
The ghoul was so compelling a figure, the word ghoul became the name of Romero's zombie in Night of the Living Dead. But the zombie's most fearsome ancestor came from Scandinavia, an undead Viking who had an insatiable appetite for human flesh. It was called the Draugr.
Draugrs were well known in Norse mythology, and these were people who had come back from the dead, but they come back as unstoppable machines. And the only way that you can stop them is by somehow luring them back into the ground.
It does retain some degree of its own intelligence, which makes it a little more frightening because it knows what it is and delights in what it is. The only thing that can stop it is a hero, and we're talking something that's superhumanly strong. So your average hero's going to be lunch.
The Nordic Draugr is history's most savage zombie. But the creature even closer to our modern zombie was Western Europe's Revenant. And the man who documented the Revenant was a 12th century English cleric named William of Newburgh, history's first zombie hunter.
He wrote about spirits who became the hungry dead. They need to feed on the living. They probably don't know why. We certainly don't know why. William of Newburgh was one of the first people to try and understand why.
To William of Newburgh, Revenants weren't just legend. They were real, on a mission to destroy us. He wrote, "One would not easily believe that corpses come out of their graves unless there were many cases supported by ample testimony."
His writings became very important to the church at the time because they were a doorway into trying to understand, identify, and eventually exterminate these monsters that were returning to plague the living. He wanted to find out if there was some way to understand this horrible need, because if we understand it, perhaps we could try to stop it.
William of Newburgh's Revenants are part of a zombie tradition that spans many civilizations over thousands of years. They have returned, and they terrify us now more than ever.
Within history, when you see societies facing a threat that is unknown to them, that they're unsure of how to handle it, the idea of the dead rising to attack the living becomes very popular.
Many believe that civilization is closer than it's ever been to total collapse.
We feel that the end of the world it's coming. There are so many elements that are pressing on us at all sides, just waiting to take society down.
There's a global war on terror. There is global warming. There is a global financial meltdown.
Natural disasters, hurricanes, melting ice caps, tsunamis. We have political strife of all sorts, including terrorism.
It's gotten to the point where you turn on your TV and everything you see could be potentially disastrous.
But the question is, how real is the threat of a zombie apocalypse?
Paranoia is really the core of our fear of zombies. You know, the fact that anyone, anytime, anywhere could be the enemy.
Even if zombies don't exist, fear is, in some ways, a social contagion. In some ways, it almost doesn't matter after a certain point whether or not the zombies actually exist. If enough people think that zombies could exist, well, then you're going to have to reassure them of that fear.
With our survival as a species at stake, zombies are back from the dead, and they are closer than you might think.
This is the katana, the weapon of the samurai, and probably the most famous blade in combat history. Samurai spent their entire lives training to perfect their technique with this weapon. Unfortunately, most of us today learn how to use this weapon by watching samurai movies, which is a great way to get yourself cut. A better option might be the machete, inexpensive and easy to find. Primarily a brush clearing tool, this weapon is also used as a weapon of fear. Fear, unfortunately, isn't a trait experienced by the living dead.
But what we fear more is the dead returning.
No matter where you are in the world, no matter what culture, what part of history, we all understand death. Everyone dies. Everything dies. And we are afraid of death.
But our fear of the dead is actually very practical, because corpses are bad for our health. What happens to the body when we die is no mystery.
Bodies exposed to the environment can pollute the water system. Many kinds of diseases can be expanded as a result. Whatever the body consists of in life is broken down into over 400 different kinds of chemicals, some of which are very aromatic. You may have heard of the smell of death. Once you smell it, you never forget it.
Given the grotesque physical reality of corpses, human beings learn to dispose of their dead quickly. One of history's first examples of burial was found in Pontynuad Cave in Wales, where remains were deliberately placed about 225,000 years ago.
The point at which we as a species began burying the dead with a degree of care, respecting the fact that they were alive and also respecting their potential as threats to the living, that was the cornerstone of civilization.
Civilizations developed burial rituals to ensure the proper treatment of the dead and to make sure they don't come back.
Underground burial, burial in tombs, burial in locked and sealed coffins were our way of making sure that the dead stayed with the dead and didn't return to us in a way that we definitely don't want to encounter.
In 2009, archaeologists dug up the skeletons of two men in Ireland, dating back to the 8th century. They weren't just buried. They were found with rocks inside their mouths. Archaeologists speculate they were buried this way to prevent them from dining on the living.
In a lot of beliefs, you have situations where they would put a brick in the mouth to prevent the corpse from biting. Preventing it from using its principal weapon was crucial.
Throughout history, many cultures have taken the threat of the dead returning seriously. The ancient Greeks took it so seriously, they invented a word for it. Mashalismos.
The ancient Greek word mashalismos actually means to mutilate the body, so it doesn't come back from the dead.
Sometimes it would be removing internal organs, heart, liver, brain, something that would prevent the vital function of the body. A lot of these rituals linger and also cross over from culture to culture to culture.
The Chinese so feared the living dead, they took no chances, physically restraining every corpse in preparation for burial.
If a body is properly buried according to the Chinese custom, it's bound so that it can't move, and it's often pinned into the coffin itself. The idea was to have it locked into what is essentially its carriage into the next world. The bindings, if done correctly, keep the body in the coffin. If done with even the slightest error, creates a monster that will continue to attack and has to be stopped by a combination of ritual and magic and force.
In Nordic traditions, instead of binding the corpse, they developed rituals to confuse the dead.
The Norse had the corpse door. The body would be moved out of the house feet first, so that the body could not look back at the house and recognize where it came from.
They would pick you up and they would take you out one door of the house. They would then seal up that door so that when you came back from the dead, that you wouldn't be able to find your way back in the house because your door was gone.
Confusing the corpse might sound like medieval superstition, but the practice continued for centuries.
Throughout the 19th century and even into the early 20th century, it was very common in Europe and even in parts of the Americas for people to carry the dead out of their homes feet first. And the reason was so that the dead person couldn't turn back and see anybody within the home and beckon them into the underworld.
Even today, many of our modern burial rituals grow out of the belief in the living dead. Take the fact that coffins are bolted shut.
We don't really actually need to bolt something shut that's going to go 6 feet under the ground. We do it anyway. There's a part of us that is afraid of something getting out. And we want to make sure that those rituals are all paid attention to so nothing happens.
The proper handling of the dead has always been a widely held human belief. When we don't treat the dead with respect, they come back. for revenge.
We see this in legend after legend, the Jiangshi, in the Draugr, in the Revenants, in the Ghouls. We see the dead who were wronged. They want to redress that wrong by attacking us.
Why do the dead want revenge? What have we done to deserve their wrath?
In a lot of cultures, the dead are viewed as being unhappy, specifically with being dead. They're aware of being dead, that they're denied life, and they're coming back to prey on the living for what they have and what the monster, the ghost, or the revenant does not have.
The idea that the dead might want revenge on the living goes back thousands of years. People believed that there were good deaths and bad deaths. A bad death prevented the dead from moving on.
The good death opens the doorway to the next world. The bad death closes it and locks you here. And that's the basis for many of our monster beliefs, especially the zombie belief, that the bad death causes that spirit to remain here and angry and vengeful.
What makes a death bad? A gruesome end, the wrong kind of burial, or a sinful life.
If there's something that twists the life of this person or the death of this person, they're bound to earth and they are driven by this insatiable hunger.
Today, most of us don't expect corpses to rise from the grave. But at the center of one of the world's great religions lies that very idea.
To this day, Christians in most denominations, when we go to church on Sunday, we recite the Nicene Creed, or the Apostolic Creed, which includes some version of, we look forward to the resurrection of the dead.
But is the resurrection a story of the undead?
The resurrection of Christ is symbolic of coming back from the dead in a positive way. You can make an argument that he's the anti-zombie. He is coming back from the dead to bring life. The whole point of Christianity is to, yes, raise the dead, but also to give eternal life, whereas a zombie is there to chomp on one's friends, family, and neighbors.
The zombie is a perfect paradigm of what life in hell would be like. Now, the point is that Christ offers you a way out of hell. He would offer you a way to exist as a non-zombie.
Is a life free of sin the key to preventing the undead? And is one of humanity's greatest sins, cannibalism, the key to understanding the zombie?
This menacing-looking weapon is the medieval mace. If you've ever swung a stick or a bat, you can use this weapon. An improvised version of the medieval mace is the simple crowbar, not only to gain access to supplies to keep you alive, but as a weapon against the living dead.
Once they crawl out of the grave, zombies have a one-track mind. They want food.
Help! Help, somebody!
What the hell happened?
He's been bitten.
And there's only one thing on the menu.
A lot of authors, myself included, have tried to explore why a zombie needs to eat. My personal take is that it would need to eat to keep its function going. So that would give it protein, would give it some energy. But there's another larger take that the zombie eats because it is trying to destroy life.
The modern zombie comes after us to eat us. What remains a mystery is why zombies' sole mission is to hunt human beings and gorge on their flesh.
Zombies are always hungry. That's the distinguishing characteristic of the modern zombie. They can't get enough to eat.
We may not know why they want our flesh, but the flesh-eating dead taps directly into one of man's strongest taboos, our fear of humans eating other humans.
Cannibalism is kind of a deal breaker for us as people, partly from disgust, partly from fear, and partly from its connection to those things in the dark that we are afraid of.
We have a primal fear of being made into food. No matter where we have been in history, there has always been the predominant belief that no matter what you do, you definitely don't eat people.
We don't have the canines, we don't have the claws really to tear each other apart very effectively. So on a practical level of grotesquerie, you certainly maximized it by having people eat people.
Stories of cannibalism can be found throughout history, including the myths of ancient Greece. The all-powerful Titan god Kronos ate his firstborn son to prevent him from seizing the throne.
Kronos had overthrown his own father for the power of the world. And so he was pretty smart about it. And he thought, okay, well, my kids are probably going to try to overthrow me. So to avoid this, he ate them.
Kronos eventually ate his first 5 children. When the 6th, Zeus, was born, his wife hid the baby away. Later, Zeus would return to kill his father. The moral of the story was clear. Cannibalism cannot be tolerated, especially when it comes to members of your own family.
The overwhelming message of cannibalism in Greek mythology, it's never a positive one. It always comes back to bite you, literally.
We don't just find cannibalism happening in myths, but in actual events. Most societies forbid it, but when people eat people they know, that violates an even deeper human instinct. One of the darkest episodes in American history involved cannibalism. The gory fate of the Donner Party proved that extreme circumstances can turn anyone into a cannibal.
The Donner Party was the world's worst road trip. They started out in 1846 and headed west to California.
A wagon train of 85 settlers began crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains.
And they get trapped there during the winter. They can't get out, and so eventually they succumb to starvation.
Half the party died, but the other half resorted to a desperate survival tactic. They ate the dead. Nourished by their fellow travelers, 48 settlers escaped the mountains. But when they returned home, they found themselves outcasts for what they had done.
After they escape, there's this stigma that sticks with the survivors, that if you've eaten human flesh once, you're going to again.
The Donner Party shocked the country with evidence that when our survival is at stake, all the rules of society disappear.
If you break a taboo and you're part of a group, you will become socially ostracized. It doesn't necessarily matter if you will be punished by the state. In some ways, in some societies, you will simply cease to exist.
In times of hunger, you don't want society turning on each other. When people are hungry, they will eat anything.
But survival isn't the only reason for cannibalism. In Canada, in the 19th century, it was something even more sinister. 1879, Alberta, Canada. After a long and brutal winter, workers at a Catholic mission were startled by the appearance of a native trapper named Swift Runner. He claimed his family had starved to death, but police soon discovered the truth. The man had butchered and eaten his wife, his 6 children, mother, and brother. Once caught, Swift Runner claimed he was possessed by a spirit called the Wendigo.
The Wendigo was supposed to be the spirit that would infect you if you ate people, and you would have to continue eating people to survive at that point. That a hunger would possess you that would just make you think of nothing else but human flesh.
After Swift Runner is hanged for his crimes, several cases of cannibalistic possession were reported across the region. People throughout Canada were seized with fear of the Wendigo, a terrifying creature that can unleash the zombie in anyone.
This drive now has a name known as Wendigo psychosis, which comes from this original Native American folklore. You wouldn't be able to stop. You would have to keep eating human flesh to survive. It would become your sole drive, almost zombie-like in the fact that you no longer have control over what you want to do.
More recently, another man driven by the hunger for human flesh brought the horror of zombies to life. In 1991, America's most notorious cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer, told investigators he killed and ate his victims because he didn't want them to leave.
Jeffrey Dahmer wanted complete power over the person, whether alive or dead. And cannibalizing body parts is a sign of total power over a person.
In his quest for complete control over his victims, Dahmer not only ate them, he tried to turn them into real-life zombies.
Dahmer would seduce men and bring them back to his house and then drill holes into their skulls and pour acid in. And what he was trying to do was create a zombie, create somebody whose mind was still there enough to function and keep them alive, but that they no longer had any element of choice.
The fascination with Jeffrey Dahmer owes a lot to our fear of cannibalism, the ultimate depravity. But eating humans hasn't always been taboo.
There have always been examples of cannibalism in prehistory. Some cultures believe there is no finer way to honor your enemy than to eat his heart. Some cultures believe there is no finer way to curse your enemy than to allow his heart to pass through your digestive tract.
Cannibalism is a global phenomenon. It's not necessarily an evil act. Sometimes it's the way in which people believe they could get the power, the knowledge, the lineage from families through the dead.
To this day, ritual cannibalism still occurs in isolated areas of Papua New Guinea. One tradition involves eating the brains of deceased relatives. But in the 1950s, that practice led to the outbreak of a mysterious contagion.
Certain tribes that practiced cannibalism later developed a disease called kuru, which caused spongy pockets of air to form in the brain.
They'll also become increasingly confused, potentially delirious, sometimes lose touch with reality. All of those things sound at least somewhat consistent with the zombies that we see on the screen.
They called this disease the shivers, or kuru. Research eventually discovered that kuru came from eating brains infected with prions.
A prion is a really creepy contagion. When they get into your brain, they essentially turn your brain to Swiss cheese. So prions are terrifying, in part because we don't quite understand how they work.
Prions are an infection unlike anything else known to man. The most well-known prion is mad cow disease, which transfers to humans when the victim consumes infected meat, leaving them in a helpless, zombie-like state.
A brain ravaged by mad cow disease will have certain elements of the zombie brain. They have myoclonic jerks. They will eventually become ataxic, unable to walk so well. They'll also become increasingly confused, potentially delirious. When we start thinking about the various potential contagions that could lead to a zombie disease, prions has got to be near the top of the list.
We can be infected by prions, and they produce zombie-like symptoms in their victims. Could these deadly brain-chewing prions unleash a zombie plague?
The battle axe, common throughout Europe, especially during the Viking Age. Unfortunately, most of us aren't 6'2" Viking berserkers. One off swing, and it's the zombie's turn. A better option might be the entrenchment tool. Soldiers have been known to file the edges to a sharp razor edge. It can be swung like an axe, or it can be thrust like a spear. Perfect for fighting zombies.
This is Tisa Farrow reporting for Channel 7 News. By all accounts, the recently deceased have returned to life. Oh no!
Zombies want to eat us. But they also have another mission: to infect us.
A zombie is raised by a disease and has a single biological imperative, which is to spread the virus by biting and consuming human beings.
That's the whole design, the whole purpose of the zombie is to make other zombies, to go out and infect others. That's why they exist.
It spreads from person to person very quickly. Sometimes it's a bite that will pass it, so it's being passed through saliva. Sometimes it's specifically the zombie blood. But the overwhelming theme is that zombie is quickly spread just like a disease or plague.
The zombie plague is fatal and incurable, and strikes indiscriminately. It's everything we most fear about disease.
Disease hunts without choice. It's going to take you down regardless of who you are, and nothing is really going to stop it. Zombie films really play with this fear, the idea that it can attack anybody.
No matter what we do, even if we try to fight it, it spreads. Because if you kill a person who's infected, they come back as a zombie. It is a growing threat that doesn't allow us to have an adequate response.
A zombie apocalypse is terrifying, not just because it's deadly to us as individuals. Even more chilling is what might happen to us as a society when faced with total annihilation.
And this really does play into the idea of neighbor against neighbor, that you can't trust the people that you're with. Your daughter can be turned into a zombie at any point, or she could turn on you to save herself in the event of, a major zombie outbreak.
The psychological aspects of a zombie plague might actually be more damaging than any of the direct effects of the contagion itself. You would be fighting something that looked like your loved one, but is no longer your loved one. That person we're looking at is now a walking manifestation of the virus. And for that reason, they're not treatable. We need to kill them.
Plagues break down the bonds of society and destroy our humanity. They don't just kill people, they bring down civilizations.
Well, the terrifying thing about plagues isn't just that they kill us. We're so powerless against them. Plagues lead to panic. Everyone turns on one another. You don't know, you can't trust anybody. But the whole fabric of society falls apart.
History has shown us the apocalyptic effects of plague before. In the 14th century, a bacteria spread from Asia to Europe, killing off 1/3 of its population in less than 2 years. They called it the Black Death, known later as the bubonic plague.
Originally, the estimations in Europe were 25 to 35% of the population of Europe. More recent literature goes up to 40, 45, 50%. The demographic mortality was incredible.
To people living through it, the Black Death
We define an apocalypse as a horrible event, something that takes down society, that the basic components of social infrastructure, law, order, government, are gone. Those who survived it essentially lived through an apocalyptic scenario.
Without a scientific explanation, no one knew why people were dying. There was no cure. They were absolutely powerless to prevent their own demise.
It crossed borders, it moved from country to country, and was near impossible for them to stop.
Those that survived tried to explain the devastation in terms of divine punishment.
People had all sorts of theories over what was causing the Black Death, but it all kind of revolved around the supernatural. And usually, because it was a fairly religious society, it was the wrath of God.
They tried repentance, but their prayers went unanswered. By the year 1400, the world's population fell by 100 million. Like a zombie apocalypse, the Black Plague was incomprehensible, and its destruction absolute.
If you want an example of what a zombie apocalypse might look like, one of the things you could look at would be the Black Plague. The terrifying thing about plagues is not just that they can kill you, but that they unhinge everything that we know. It completely disintegrates the cultural atmosphere.
Then, in 1918, an even more deadly plague struck. This time, it spread across the globe, killing nearly 50 million people in less than 3 years. It was called the Spanish flu, the first known appearance of the dreaded H1N1 virus, or avian flu.
It probably killed more people in a shorter span of time than virtually any other outbreak, including the bubonic plague. It killed more American soldiers in World War I than who died in the actual fighting.
The 1918 flu pandemic was especially baffling and terrifying because, unlike most diseases, it didn't prey on the weak.
What was so peculiar about this version of influenza is its impact on people in the prime of their lives. Normally, influenza outbreaks affect the very young, infants, and the old, who are more susceptible. But in this particular case, young people were affected in huge numbers.
Once again, a mysterious plague devoured people and societies on a mass scale. But it wasn't only the flu that did the damage. An increasingly global world helped the disease spread rapidly and totally.
There was a kind of perfect storm that occurred around the early part of the 20th century. We just finished the first major world war, so the infrastructure of previously developed societies had really been taken down. The very same time, you had people traveling around the globe more readily than they had ever done before. So you had all of these things coming together, and the Spanish flu was basically able to take advantage of it.
Not only did it sort of take the book of medicine and throw it in the trash, the notion that it was influenza, only influenza, was so terrifying because it was underestimated. Initially, people said, it's the flu. It's not going to kill people. I mean, we're not going to shut down the government. We're not going to declare an all-hands-on-deck emergency because of influenza. Come on. I think that is exactly how a lot of people would respond to a zombie plague.
The Spanish flu pandemic gives us a glimpse into what a zombie apocalypse would look like.
Rest assured, in their first response to zombies, governments will screw up. They will likely try to reassure the public because what governments are afraid of most is social panic. The moment that you have a lack of faith in government institutions, that's when public trust starts to break down and the kind of post-apocalyptic scenarios start to become conceivable.
Like in a zombie apocalypse, the Spanish flu devastated entire populations because people could not imagine or would not face the possibility of extinction. Even worse, in times of pandemics, denial can quickly turn to panic.
In all plague scenarios, you're going to go through an element of denial, which will then boomerang into mass panic.
When plagues have hit society in the past, there is first almost always a sense of panic or uncertainty, in large part because people don't know what's causing the plague. And until you do know what's causing it, there will be various wild conspiracy theories.
In our own time, other potential pandemics have emerged that raise the specter of another global apocalypse. SARS, mad cow disease, the West Nile virus. They proved less dangerous than first feared, and they have helped prepare us for the next and perhaps more horrifying outbreak.
There's been West Nile virus. There's been H1N1. There's been the SARS virus. There's been mad cow disease. These bugs have seemingly come out of nowhere, have gotten a lot of press, and because of that, we've gotten better at recognizing the early warning signs and being able to distinguish them from all the other things that make people sick. That would be essential for recognizing an early outbreak of a zombie plague.
Scientists have begun using the model of a zombie plague as a way of studying pandemics. Their conclusions are not exactly comforting.
A group of biomathematicians at Carleton University in Canada who normally study pandemics created a very sophisticated linear programming model to see what would happen if, in fact, you had these kinds of zombies. And their conclusion was rather dire. They decided that unless the zombies were wiped out at a very early stage in their development, human civilization as we know it would be wiped out.
Can science save us? When it comes to diseases, it seems like our best hope. But what if science is not enough?
Facing a zombie completely unarmed is the most dangerous type of zombie combat you can encounter. Now, this particular zombie is pretty tall, so one thing that I can do is attack the legs. As your opponent attacks, they drop down, hook the back of his legs, and push his shin with my shoulder, taking him off balance. From here, I can make my exit or finish him with a stomp to the head.
One zombie is easily defeated. The problem is, they rarely travel alone. They move in hordes.
Anybody can handle one zombie. You can eat a sandwich while you're walking away from a zombie. So one zombie's never a problem. 5 zombies isn't really a problem, but a horde of zombies, that's the problem.
Zombies move slowly, but they never stop advancing. And even worse, they multiply and multiply.
What makes a zombie horde so powerful is their numbers. Their limitless number, it's just masses of the dead. There are so many of them that it appears like an army.
Killing them is useless. They're already dead. And what they lack in speed, they make up for in persistence.
Zombies are immensely relentless. No legs, they keep dragging. No foot, they keep dragging. No hands, they keep shambling towards you. All they need is some way to ambulate and teeth.
The shock of a zombie invasion isn't only a result of their numbers, or that they are relentless. They surround you, closing off any escape.
People's first nature seems to be to find a place that they can barricade themselves in that zombies cannot get to them. And the problem with this becomes that you're stuck in a room without food, water, limited supplies at best.
The siege is a theme common to every zombie film. The advancing horde surrounds a handful of heroes who hole up in a defensible position to make a last stand.
It's just masses of the dead. There are so many of them that it appears like an army.
Killing them is useless. They're already dead. And what they lack in speed, they make up for in persistence.
Zombies are immensely relentless. No legs, they keep dragging. No foot, they keep dragging. No hands, they keep shambling towards you. All they need is some way to ambulate and teeth.
The shock of a zombie invasion isn't only a result of their numbers, or that they are relentless. They surround you, closing off any escape.
People's first nature seems to be to find a place that they can barricade themselves in that zombies cannot get to them. And the problem with this becomes that you're stuck in a room without food, water, limited supplies at best.
The siege is a theme common to every zombie film. The advancing horde surrounds a handful of heroes who hole up in a defensible position to make a last stand.
Siege warfare has been used very successfully throughout history, from the Visigoths to the Mongols to the Nazis. It's really a war of attrition. With a zombie attack, that's the ultimate in siege warfare, because you have an enemy that's not going to run out of resources, that's not going to walk away and give up the fight. You know, in a war of attrition, the zombie's gonna win.
The unstoppable horde provokes a deep-seated and ancient anxiety. Fear of being outnumbered, surrounded, and destroyed.
If we go all the way back in time to the origin of humans, to what we call cavemen, they were called cavemen for a reason. You had 3 walls of stone and then 1 opening. And they were barricading themselves into a place that they felt safe to keep everything that was bad outside.
Throughout human history, there is a primal fear of the horde. There's always a danger that when you and your band set up a civilization, that somehow over the next hill is a group of people that haven't done any of that stuff. And they're hungry and they're desperate and they're going to try and take everything away. Because it has happened. Human history is littered with the corpses of dead civilizations that fell when a horde invaded their city.
One of the most famous examples of a destructive horde appeared in Rome in the 5th century. For nearly 1,000 years, Rome had stood at the center of the most powerful empire on Earth. But suddenly, from the uncivilized north came the Visigoths, a wild tribe that relentlessly swarmed the city.
Well, the Romans were terrified of the Visigoths. Suddenly they were surrounded by these brutish, wild barbarians who were about to storm through their most sacred places. To have them actually sack their city was the end of civilization as far as they knew it.
Within 2 years, the Visigoths had swallowed Rome whole. The so-called Eternal City was no more. 800 years later, the most famous horde in history thundered out of Central Asia, slaughtering everything in its path. In fact, the word horde comes from the Mongols. They brought a new brutality to warfare, boiling and crushing their victims, catapulting severed heads.
Any invading army is terrifying, but there is a reason why we still talk about the Mongolian invaders. They would pillage, they would eat their prisoners. They were particularly brutal in their tactics.
There are times when we're faced with an overwhelming threat, something so vast, something so big, that it frightens us and even detaches us from our own protective group. The Mongol horde is a perfect example. It's that shock and awe concept of so much so soon that there is no adequate defense.
In the mid-13th century, the Mongol horde stormed into the city of Baghdad and laid waste to the jewel of the Islamic Empire. For centuries afterward, the once glittering city remained an empty wreck.
We talk about the 410 sacking of Rome, and we talk about how the sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols sort of ended the Islamic Golden Age. I think that it is embedded in our psyche that everything we've built can be destroyed by a horde.
Many zombie movies depict a city under siege by a relentless army bent on total destruction. That scenario played out in more recent times during World War II. This time, the horde was the Nazis.
When we talk about the zombie apocalypse, we have a tendency to think of the apocalypse as an abstraction. But this is something we've actually seen in various places around the world. A good example is the siege of Leningrad.
Leningrad, 1941. Thousands of Nazi troops surrounded the Soviets' cultural capital, triggering one of the longest and deadliest sieges in history. Battles raged for nearly 900 days. Thousands starved to death in the streets.
It was called the Hero City, and the majority of citizens were indeed heroic. But there was always one black marketeer who could sell you a little meat cake. Nobody ever admitted there was cannibalism in Leningrad, and nobody ever asked where that meat came from.
Everyone was at war. There was constant murder. There was cannibalism. There was every kind of horror. It was total, absolute war. Anyone living in that moment was living at the end of the world.
I think World War II in the East more closely resembles a zombie war than World War II in the West. Suddenly, Russians looked up and saw panzers rolling across their wheat fields, and there was no negotiation. Churchill referred to the Nazis as mechanized barbarians. The word barbarian means that there is no common ground. And I think that's absolutely terrifying for people.
Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder.
Unlike other military enemies, the invasion of the Horde has always represented a more terrifying cruelty. A force that will not surrender until it has achieved total destruction. But today, our enemy is more terrifying still. They don't even look like an army. We know them as terrorists.
I think that the Bush administration played on the notion of zombies very succinctly when they described terrorists. There was absolutely no way to negotiate. They would follow us home, literally like zombies, and there was nothing we could do to stop them except destroy them.
The war on terror has pit us against a relentless enemy without a face, beyond reason, and with no fear of death.
The zombie is a great imprint for kind of war on terror, because you're not battling a particular state or country or group of people. You're battling what in essence is an ideology. This is a threat that could be on the streets of any city, in any town, in the country.
We're still fighting the war on terror, but is it also preparing us for a zombie apocalypse?
The stronger our culture gets, we are so powerful that we believe that there is nothing big enough to come and overwhelm us. A zombie horde would be that thing. And once we see it, the fact of it, just seeing it, would be so shocking to us that it would probably break our spirit right there.
Unlike any other army in history, the zombie siege not only comes from over the next hill, it can start within your own community, even within your own home. But what's more terrifying, the zombie could be a monster that we unleash.
The spear is one of the oldest weapons in history, the earliest versions of which were nothing more than a stick with a sharpened tip. It requires a very precise thrust, which may be difficult when facing the living dead. Another effective tool at long range is the sidewalk scraper. It can be a very effective zombie weapon. Its large, flat blade can be used to thrust, and if it can crack the harsh northern winter ice, it can certainly do the same to the zombie skull.
How do these things stay alive? Look at this thing.
It's been shot full of holes, and it keeps snapping wet.
Zombies return from the dead. They eat human flesh. They spread like a virus. They invade like a relentless army. But the most terrifying thing of all, we create them.
In a lot of zombie fiction, we see that humans are the cause for the zombie outbreak. It's biological warfare. It's something that we've created.
We might be responsible for bringing zombies to life, sometimes unintentionally.
Very often, one of the ways in which zombies are created is not intentionally, but rather through an accident at a secret government lab.
In many stories, humans try to harness the power of nature for our own purposes. But the technology we create ends up unleashing a destructive force that consumes us, a zombie apocalypse.
Hanging in the background is this idea that somehow we've done something. Either radiation, genetic engineering, bioterror weapon, something. We've done something to unleash this.
There's a fear that by tweaking with science, we're ultimately tweaking with our own destiny and creating these super bugs, so to speak, that will end up causing our demise.
The fear of the destructive power of our technology is ancient. In Greek mythology, Prometheus steals fire from Zeus and gives it to humankind. As punishment, Zeus sends Pandora, who opens a box and releases the sum of all evils into the world.
The Prometheus myth is the original story of someone who goes too far, who steals the fire of the gods and is punished for it. Now, the zombie myth fits into that entirely. It's exactly our fear of creating something that's going to destroy us.
The moral of the Prometheus myth: meddle with dangerous technology, and it will destroy you. In later versions of the myth, Prometheus first fashions the human race out of clay, then gives them fire. Zeus punishes Prometheus by chaining him to a rock, where an eagle comes and feasts on his flesh.
These are cautionary tales about man playing God, that you shouldn't try to create your own beasts, and that ultimately what is dead, you should allow to stay dead.
In the Prometheus myth, man plays God, and he is devoured. Enshrined in Jewish folklore is another zombie-like story of how man's creation can turn against him. It's the famous tale of the golem.
In the Jewish tradition, they have the story of the golem, which was imbued with life by the rabbi of Prague in the 16th century to protect the Jews from persecution, but goes out of control, and it becomes this powerful, relentless sort of monster.
The golem grew increasingly violent, killing Gentiles and Jews alike, and finally turned on its creator.
The golem goes crazy, and then it's up to the creator to take it down and decide how it can be destroyed.
The rabbi was forced to kill the golem by removing the amulet around its neck that gave it life.
The Golem is a perfect tale about why we shouldn't try to play God. It's the classic cautionary tale. We don't know enough about the universe. We think we do, and hubris is something that often comes back to bite us.
In 1816, Mary Shelley wrote her own cautionary tale about the destructive potential of technology. She created the most famous zombie in history, the monster of Dr. Frankenstein. The book's subtitle was The Modern Prometheus. Another story about what happens when humans try to play God.
Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein at a time of great scientific innovation. It was challenging the way that people related to God and to knowledge and to what was possible and what was not possible. People were afraid that we were tinkering with nature in a way that was more bad than good.
Shelley drew on the Prometheus story of a mortal making humans from clay. But in her story, Dr. Frankenstein brings life to the dead. He builds his monster by stitching together segments of corpses. Dr. Frankenstein jolts the monster to life using the electric shock of lightning called galvanization.
Galvanization is a theory that came out in the late 1700s that if you applied an electrical charge to a corpse, that it would reanimate it.
In the early 19th century, an Italian scientist named Giovanni Aldini used this technique in attempts to reanimate the corpses of executed criminals. Aldini's experiments produced muscle spasms, facial twitches, and reactions in a cadaver's heart. London newspapers erroneously reported that one convict, George Forrester, had been brought back to life.
The case of George Forrester being electrified till he came back from the dead was one of the primary influences on Mary Shelley to write Frankenstein. In Frankenstein, I think that Mary Shelley was making a large commentary on technology getting ahead of us. That as we discover these new technologies, we shouldn't be playing God. We should be accepting of death as death.
When Shelley wrote Frankenstein, people feared how science and new technology might destroy an old way of life. But by 1968, when George Romero made Night of the Living Dead, people worried that our technology could destroy life altogether.
The Night of the Living Dead came out in 1968. It was the height of the Cold War. There was a very real sense that the human race was pushing itself to the edge of nuclear destruction.
In Romero's film, the origins of the zombie plague are vague, but the movie suggests it is related to a NASA satellite leaking radiation. Romero's zombies invoke an ancient fear that the technology we develop to control our world is really in control of us. Today, biological weapons have become our Frankenstein.
A pathogen doesn't need to have tanks. It's small, it's easily portable. It's the kind of weapon a terrorist group would pick because they can't put an army in the field big enough to oppose a country like America. So their army would be virus, bacteria, prion, something small and something which they can use to create unlimited damage.
Biological warfare actually has an old history. In 1346, a Mongol army surrounded the Genoese trading outpost of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. Instead of firepower, the Mongols attacked with corpses.
Their armies were struck by the plague, and they actually launched bodies into Kaffa to spread the disease.
At that point, people from within the city started to depart. This is the first instance of biological warfare being used in combat.
The fleeing survivors of Kaffa spread the plague throughout Europe. Today, scientists have learned how to manufacture viruses and weaponize them. In 2001, packets of the deadly virus anthrax were sent to a string of targets across the United States, killing 5 people and infecting 17 others.
Think about what happened in 2001 in the United States when there were anthrax attacks right after the September 11th attacks. In some ways, the anthrax attacks actually generated far more panic than the initial terrorist attacks.
The anthrax threat was eerily similar to the horrors of a zombie apocalypse. Anthrax itself kills in part by eating away at human flesh. And in the case of the 2001 attacks, investigators traced the source of the anthrax to a U.S. biological weapons lab. Once again, those who played with fire got burned.
The fear is that something that's developed that might affect the population in a very bad way is going to be released, whether knowingly or unknowingly. And should that happen, what are the ramifications? So that always speaks to, well, how is what's being developed contained?
Fears of a zombie apocalypse now often involve the renewed threat of bioterrorism.
There's been a tremendous amount of talk in media and in the military about whether a zombie virus could be weaponized. And the answer is actually yes. There are a lot of different pathogens, parasites, disease combinations that can be easily weaponized and can create a zombie-like plague.
Is a zombie-like plague really possible? There's no doubt we have the technology. But will the technology save us or destroy us?
In military and law enforcement, it's often taught to shoot center mass. There's many vital organs in the upper torso of the human body. But for a zombie, it's gonna take a headshot. We need to turn off the light switch.
that are coming in from around the city. The situation here is descending into...
Today, zombies surround us. In comic books, on TV, in movies. But what if they were really here? There are people who are actively considering just that scenario.
Former Vice President Richard Cheney talked about the 1% problem. If there was even a 1% chance that Al-Qaeda launches a terrorist attack on the United States, the consequences would be so grave that it would be worth doing any kind of countermeasure possible to prevent that from happening. Now let's concede that the likelihood of a zombie attack is much lower. The consequences are so grave that I think we have to engage in policy planning now rather than wait for the inevitable.
Those preparing for a zombie apocalypse believe it's a good way to prepare for the worst, whether it's a zombie invasion or any catastrophic event.
I do have a zombie preparedness kit. It is called my earthquake kit. And there is nothing in that kit that I would not need in a zombie plague, right down to the crowbar. There's nothing in your zombie preparedness kit you wouldn't have in a disaster preparedness kit.
You have your home set up. You have a supply of food and water for at least 3 days. If your house or where you're living is unstable, you have a plan.
Surviving a disaster isn't just about stocking up. It's also about acquiring real survival skills. J.L. Bourne, a naval officer trained in survival and author of popular zombie novels, has applied his training to the possibility of a zombie invasion.
Survival isn't all about guns, band-aids, and beans in some cave somewhere. Learning to survive is just thinking about and the skills you need to learn.
But survival skills alone are not enough.
Survival isn't about the best gear, the best guns, the best equipment. Survival is about driving yourself to get through the hardships ahead.
How can you prepare to survive a zombie apocalypse? Something we've never experienced before.
Pop culture would tell you that bugging out is the best option. And, just grab your bag, grab your gun, grab your gear, head out on the wastelands and become a nomad. I'm here to tell you that bugging out should be one of your last resorts. You want to remain in place as long as you can.
If you're going to stay put, then you have to be prepared to turn your home into a fortress.
As far as fortifying the average home, the average person could go to the hardware store and go ahead and get some plywood and have it ready like you would for a hurricane to keep your windows from being smashed out.
Survival experts call outfitting your home bugging in. But when that fails, and you have to set out into the post-apocalyptic wilderness, that's called bugging out. It's a person's last resort for survival, and for good reason. You have to abandon all your possessions.
If I had to bug out, these are some of the items I'd bring with me. We'll start with water. Food's the second most important thing. I'm also going to bring a medical kit with me, a signal mirror. I can use this fire still when this lighter fails, and I'm also going to bring security, a way to keep myself safe from any threats that I might encounter. So I'm definitely bringing a firearm with me. My priority would be to keep things light, because ounces lead to pounds, and pounds lead to pain.
When bugging out, your only means of transportation may be on foot.
If you think you can hump 25 miles with a pack in a day during a zombie apocalypse, you're really mistaken.
Without cell towers, without GPS, without a map, how will you know where you're going?
You can waste a lot of calories going in the wrong direction. So finding your direction is going to be critical out there. You can use a compass. You can use the sun. Some people like to use vegetation or moss growing on a tree. You can find a general direction using one urban means of direction finding. If you take a look at these small satellite dishes at the top of some of the structures in your neighborhood, they generally point south.
Once you figure out how to navigate the post-apocalyptic wasteland, your goals will be extremely basic.
High on my priority list if I'm bugging out in a zombie wasteland is a source of water. I want to find some place where I can fill up my water bottle and purify it. Right after that is going to be food. Ideally, I can go in and find some food in an abandoned store, but that should not be your primary plan because chances are it's probably already been taken. So your backup plan is going to be wild game.
And what if wild game isn't abundant? At times, surviving an apocalyptic scenario requires the skills of a pioneer. At other times, the skills of an insurgent.
I'm going to have to keep my eyes out for any homes that are abandoned that I might be able to extract food from. When you're approaching a house, you want to be very careful in your approach. You want to make sure that it is abandoned. If not, you want to communicate with those inside so they know you're not hostile.
When inside, your mission is simple. Find the basic elements for survival.
Food, water, shelter, and security. Those are my priorities. I'm going to look for things like plastic trash bags to be able to make a solar still to gather more water. I'm also going to look for things like candles. I'm going to head into the kitchen. I'm going to head into the bathroom, places like that where I can find some household bleach that I can use to purify water.
But food and shelter are not enough to survive. There's another bigger problem. Zombies are out there, and they are coming after you. What can you do to stop them?
If an apocalypse happens, if we're faced with a real threat, I don't want to be doing jump spinning ninja death kicks. I want to be doing something direct and practical. If you break the knee, which anyone can learn to do in a couple of seconds with one or two basic kicks, the zombie's going to fall down. A crawling zombie is not as much of a threat as a walking zombie.
Disabling a zombie helps, but the only way to stop one is to destroy its brain.
Zombies are killed by bashing in their heads. Every movie you see, it's the gun, it's a hammer, you gotta hit them in the head.
And your basic blunt object can do the job.
My preference is for a blunt weapon. Most people know how to swing a heavy object, whether that object is a hammer, whether that object is a 2x4, or whether it's a real weapon like a mace.
Some say the more practical choice would be a weapon with many uses.
My weapon of choice is probably the machete because it's light. I can use it to chop firewood, I can use it to clear brush, and also it's a peasant's weapon. I tell people who want fancy weapons like a samurai sword that you kind of need to be a samurai.
But not everyone agrees that melee weapons would be enough.
Given the human skull, you're just going to wear yourself out if you're trying to beat them all to death. Even though the conventional wisdom is you want a melee weapon because they don't run out of ammo, and you certainly can't rely on that.
Still, others believe nothing can replace sheer firepower, including firearms expert Kyle DeFour.
My weapon of choice in dealing with the undead, really an M4. I mean, I say that because it gives me standoff. You know, I can stay further away from whoever.
But which firearm would be best?
Let's look at 4 readily available and popular firearms that you could use during a zombie apocalypse. Now, the M4 or the AR-15 is based on the M16 platform that came into service in the late 50s and early 60s. The magazines hold 30 rounds. There's an abundance of different types of ammo available. Disadvantages, it's going to be a little bit harder to conceal, and ammo for this gun might be a little bit hard to come by. For up close zombie threats, handguns are a great choice, like this .22 target pistol right here. Advantages to this: the rounds are very small, they're available at hardware stores, and you can carry a lot on your person. Disadvantages, you're only going to get about 25 to 50 meters of good distance out of this weapon, and it's not going to punch through any type of barrier very well. Shot placement is critical. If you look right here, my entrance wound where I put it was somewhere right above the bridge of the nose. We follow it to the back and we see the exit wound, and the exit wound's not near as dramatic, but it still got the job done. And another popular handgun is a 9mm handgun. 9mm kind of bridges the gap between .22 and, say, a 12 gauge. It gives you excellent barrier penetration. They're accurate and they're effective out to about 50 meters. Disadvantages: 9mm, again, might be hard to find unless you're near a military or law enforcement area. This is a pump-action shotgun, like this Remington 870. They've been around for over 100 years. They fire a 12-gauge round and are devastating up close in both terminal ballistics and barrier penetration. and a devastating wound. On the back side back here, if we look, it is total destruction. Pons medulla is completely gone. The zombie spine cut in half. This is probably one of the premier zombie hunting guns right here.
Whatever weapon you choose, there's a lot more to consider than simply firepower when it comes to battling zombies.
What does it mean to be by yourself with no quartermaster corps, no supply train, no replacement parts, no replacement ammo?
Having the right weapon might help protect you from the threat of zombies, but it's harder to prepare for the complicated moral dilemmas we would face.
In a real zombie plague, you're going to come up against tremendous social, moral, religious barriers. Is somebody really going to want to turn their child over to the CDC? Or are they going to keep their child tied up in their room hoping that somebody's going to come up with a cure? Is somebody really going to let a neighbor shoot their mother in the head?
If disaster strikes, we want to believe we will have what it takes to survive. We want to believe we can do it all alone. But can we?
Ladies and gentlemen, our world is now a very different place. While the enemy may look like our friends, our family, they are no longer who we remember them to be. Only through swift, decisive action will we send them back to the gates of hell.
Across America, citizens are trying to imagine what a zombie apocalypse might look like. Even the U.S. government has turned its attention to zombies. In May of 2011, the Centers for Disease Control published an official memo on how to survive a zombie apocalypse.
A gentleman at the CDC wrote on the CDC's official blog a piece about zombie preparedness. And his point was that preparing for a zombie apocalypse is exactly like preparing for all of the other disasters that we've been hearing about for the last 10 or 15 or so years.
When they came and asked me about it, I said, absolutely, establish a zombie task force, and let's think about a creative way to engage people in thinking about their own personal preparedness.
Zombies are the perfect 21st century threat. If you think about the sort of common threats that we have to cope with, pandemics, climate change, terrorist attacks, zombies perfectly map onto these kind of ill-defined threats.
If you can get a bunch of young people to start learning about stocking up on food and water and medical gear, it doesn't matter whether you tell them zombies or not. The point is, they're ready.
A zombie attack would be a crisis on an unimaginable scale. What would a zombie invasion look like? The apocalypse would probably begin quietly. A few unfortunate doctors would see the first infections.
In a zombie apocalypse, a hospital, any hospital where victims are brought, will be ground zero.
Hospitals routinely go through disaster drills. We had a disaster drill where we had 20 of our employees acting as patients. And even though our hospital is fairly large, it really stretched the resources of the hospital to deal with patients in the 20s. Can you imagine if we were faced with patients in the thousands?
It's a numbers game that makes the zombie apocalypse so terrifying and so devastating in terms of optimism.
First responders would have little time to react, as hospitals would quickly become overwhelmed.
The first line of defense for a zombie outbreak is to keep our heads. And I mean that both literally and figuratively, to say this is something we haven't seen before. It's something that we've gotten better at in the last 10 years or so because of the emergence of pandemics.
When somebody is brought in who's infected, the responding doctors, they're going to see unusual symptoms. They might try treating it with drugs, but they're not going to know to approach it as something that needs to be absolutely stopped. Doctors aren't going to kill patients to prevent them from infecting others.
As the infection spreads and the population succumbs to the virus, the infrastructure would collapse.
It won't take long for the grid to go down. You see disruptions in electric, gas, things like that, because there simply wouldn't be enough people to occupy those positions and keep the infrastructure up and running.
The social order would start to crumble.
As soon as the governments fail, there'll be a short time that we as a society try to maintain an order. Because we do not have a central figurehead, it's going to become a number of different pockets battling each other for order, and then everything breaks loose.
With supply systems disrupted, finding food and water would become a life or death struggle.
Because of globalization, we as a society have become more dependent on same-day fresh delivery. What's going to happen when those trucks aren't rolling? What's going to happen when the ships stop sailing and when the planes stop flying? The scary thing about a zombie apocalypse is they can kill us in so many ways that have nothing to do with actual physical contact. They can kill us by starvation, by dehydration, by disease.
As in any disaster, survival would depend on good communication, using what's left of the media to share information with anyone left alive.
First line of defense against a zombie outbreak would be a communication of information. If we kept ourselves together, if we were able to understand the nature of the threat, then things like cell phones and the internet, texting, that's going to be our first line of defense. It kind of sounds funny that Twitter might actually stand between us and the apocalypse, but it could very well be the thing.
Communication will be essential, but it will not be enough. The military would have to marshal its arsenal to fight the zombie horde. And fighting an army of zombies would require an entirely new military strategy.
Modern armies are going to have to rethink their strategy when dealing with undead hordes. They're going to have to know the tactics on how to evade their enemy. I think that the modern army is going to shoot a lot less and evade a lot more when it comes to going against a zombie horde. You shoot a gun once to take out one zombie, there could be 10,000 around the corner that heard the shot.
Even with a new strategy, no army could win on its own. We would also depend on the international community to seal off borders to isolate the infected country and stop the spread of the zombie virus.
Germs don't know national borders. Germs don't understand national policies.
There's a real incentive to very quickly identify what's going on and sharing that information. You get help from other countries to help you take care of your own outbreak, and you get additional information to try to quickly understand how to get rid of the outbreak.
Past pandemics have shown us that open communication between governments and citizens is crucial in stopping a deadly outbreak.
Authoritarian regimes are very reluctant to admit that they have a problem. Think back to 2003 when the SARS epidemic first broke out in China, the extent to which China concealed information that was vital for the rest of the world to know.
What they learned is that willingness to selectively release information actually put them at greater risk, not lesser risk. They actually had to sort of branch out and embrace the world in order to help themselves.
The SARS outbreak was a sentinel outbreak for the worldwide community, and it's highly less likely nowadays that countries would not report what's going on.
Can we depend on the government to save us from total annihilation? Recent history has shown us that governments may not always be our most reliable asset during major catastrophes.
Katrina showed us what a zombie apocalypse might look like, in that you saw a complete breakdown of the system at every level, from the president down to the New Orleans Police Department. You really saw a city disintegrate day after day after day, right down to people standing on their roofs, holding up signs, screaming for help, which is exactly what you would see in a zombie outbreak.
The lessons learned after events like Katrina have helped governments around the world rethink their disaster response strategies. But in the face of a zombie apocalypse, even their best efforts might not be good enough.
All bureaucracies out there, including public health and first responder bureaucracies, are trained to deal with standard operating procedures. They all develop standard operating procedures as a way to sort of routinize their interactions with the outside world. I think it's safe to say that the living dead would represent a non-standard outcome. So in all likelihood, if they were to deal with them at first, they simply wouldn't know that they were making mistakes, and they would, as a result, make those mistakes. The bureaucratic politics on this issue would be bloody in every sense of the word.
If we can't count on the government to save us, and we can't save ourselves, then what?
Now, the mistake a lot of people make is that they only worry about the zombie's mouth and don't understand that there are two outstretched hands looking to grab you in as well. This triangular sector comprised of the mouth and the hands is what I call the fatal funnel. What you want to do is avoid the fatal funnel by stepping off and checking the hand. Grab the throat, hook the leg, push the head. Now, where the head goes, the body will follow. And from here, you can either make your escape or finish your opponent with a head stomp.
worst nightmare has occurred. Zombies have invaded, and the devastation has been total. A new generation emerges to rebuild. Generation Z.
The generation of children that grew up in a zombie plague would have grown up in hardship, and they would be a lot tougher. They would be the equivalent of my grandparents of the Second World War, who, till the day they died, still washed their plastic bags and put water in the grape juice bottle because we had to make it last.
When you compare the generations and how they might fare in a zombie apocalypse, of course, we can go back to the greatest generation of World War II. They were very rugged individuals. They came through the Depression. They came through a hard war.
As society rebuilds, what will the new world look like?
After a zombie apocalypse, the economy is going to shift dramatically to something to more of a barter and producing-based economy. We're going to be forced to produce to consume. And learning how to make things with your hands is going to become very important.
High-tech industries will vanish as a post-apocalyptic society prioritizes more basic human needs.
Anyone who is not immediately able to contribute to either defense or the supply chain are going to be very much secondary citizens.
Professions that are going to be of extreme value are going to be sectors that actually do things that save lives and feed people. Doctors, farmers are going to be very essential. Engineers, mechanics, so that you can generate electricity to run some infrastructure.
What are things like up there?
Well, it's not too good.
In the aftermath of full-scale disaster, some will be tempted to abandon the idea of a common good and take survival into their own hands.
In a lot of post-apocalyptic and disaster movies, you do see that lone wolf scenario. The one guy kind of out there with the stockpile of guns, me against the world. I think we've got a lot of romantic notions. Push comes to shove, I want to see you plant a garden all by yourself and harvest it.
The Rambo survivalists think that it's going to be one giant testosterone ride with guns and flamethrowers that they make. Then there are the real survivalists that really understand how to purify water, how to grow their own food, how to care for their kids when they come down with a disease, what plants to eat. Those are the people that would last much longer than the wannabe Rambos.
Most agree that long-term survival will depend on cooperation, on rebuilding the social fabric that the zombies destroy.
An individual cannot rebuild a civilization. The reason we as a species have survived and triumphed is because we learned to work together. And in this country, the notion of working together has sort of become taboo. But the truth is, in a crisis, people need to come together. They need to trade. They need to form some sort of mutual protective society.
Communities form easily when everyone shares something in common, the need to survive. But when the immediate threat has passed, seeing a common purpose becomes more difficult.
At first, we're all going to be pulling together to run somewhere or barricade a door or do whatever we can. But then when it comes time to wait, that's when personality types emerge. It's going to require the emergence of a charismatic leader within each group for it to survive.
If we fail to survive a zombie apocalypse, it may ultimately have less to do with zombies and more to do with us.
We prey upon each other at the time when we're the weakest. We've seen so many incidents where society has fallen down. If there's a way in which we're absolutely going to lose, that's going to be it.
Zombies are not the thing to fear. The thing to fear is what humans are capable of doing when they're afraid.
If human nature is often our own worst enemy, is there anything we can do to prevent us from self-destructing? In St. Louis, Missouri, one group is taking action ahead of time. Meet the Zombie Squad.
The Zombie Squad is an organization that was started as a group of friends who were really into zombie movies who liked to talk about how they could survive better than the characters in the movies. And it turned into a discussion of real-life skills that you need to survive.
The Zombie Squad's message is simple. The lone wolf survival model doesn't work. To endure a major disaster, it's going to take a community.
You're much better off if you have a group of people around you who you're friends with, you work well with, you have a relationship with.
The Zombie Squad isn't about taking out zombies. They organize canned food collections and blood drives for the Red Cross.
We have fun, we go out and cause a little bit of a ruckus, but at the same point in time, we're catching people's interest. It's build a community, get to know your neighbors. And if you already have a group of like-minded people, you're gonna have a better chance of surviving.
At first, not everyone is able to take the Zombie Squad seriously, including members of local government.
I was like, what? They're dressed like zombies? Is this Halloween? The Zombie Squad training provided excellent material support. People came away pushing our thinking on how we can build the fabric of community in different ways.
Our belief really is if you prepare for zombies, a tornado really isn't that big of a deal. An earthquake is something you can prepare for.
The people responsible for saving us during a catastrophe have started taking the Zombie Squad seriously.
The members of Zombie Squad have helped us out with our training for the regional SWAT team. They have come out and played the roles of suspects and victims. The higher the stress level in training, the better they're going to react in real world. So as realistic as we can make it, the better.
What began as an online community in St. Louis has expanded into a worldwide organization with 28 chapters and 20,000 active members.
We've got authors and movie producers and scientists and nuclear physicists and the military, and they're all coming together to make this a great resource of information.